American foreign policy is at its best when we really face a crisis.
The United States is no longer going to be the policeman of the world.
Mr. Putin has said there need to be new rules of global order or there'll be no rules.
Syria is dead. There is no Syria.
When the US said we will not take sides, that was practically saying to China, go ahead, grab those reefs. And that's exactly what happened.
What's the common denominator? The common denominator is an American retreat.
Should we look for substitutes? Replace what America may be taking away.
I worry about some of the lessons that China is learning.
This is the time for them to challenge Americans' leadership.
Annexing Crimea, attacking Ukraine, throwing the international rule book out of the window.
No one else can do it. We will be the dominant power for the rest of this century, and we need a foreign policy that is adequate to our primacy.
Major funding for this program was provided by Robert and Marion Oster. Additional funding was provided by Hoover Institution, Stanford University, L.E. Phillips Family Foundation, Sarah Scaife Foundation, the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, Incorporated, and FedEx.
My name is Johan Norberg. As a writer and analyst here in Sweden, it's my job to observe political, cultural, and economic happenings around the world. Through my research and my travels, I've come to recognize how the actions and interests of the United States pervade nearly every aspect of our increasingly global community. But in this period of economic doubt, terrorist attacks, and a trend toward political isolationism, I wonder if America's role in the world is beginning to change. How would that affect people here in Europe and all over the world?
I've come to New York City to meet with Bret Stephens, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist and author of the book America in Retreat, to find out where he believes America has scaled back its involvement in the world and perhaps sparked instability in the process.
Let me point to three key areas. One, of course, is the Middle East. Syria became the metastasizing cancer of the Middle East. A refugee crisis was born out of the chaos of Syria. The collapse of American credibility with a broken red line also comes out of Syria. Next, take the South China Sea. Not only is China trying to bully weaker powers like the Philippines and Vietnam, it's also trying to bully an equal power like Japan. And finally, take Ukraine. For the first time in recent history, the idea of Russia-NATO confrontation is realistic. What's the common denominator? The common denominator is an American retreat. It's a perception by the bullies of the world, whether they're in Beijing or Moscow or in Damascus, that American power, American assurances, American promises aren't serious, and that America isn't interested or isn't seriously interested in defending its interests, its values, or its friends.
In 2014, fierce fighting broke out here in eastern Ukraine between government forces and Russian-backed separatists. The destruction is inescapable.
Slovyansk, Ukraine, was once a neighborhood for working-class people and their families. Now some parts of it, like this, in complete ruins. How does violent conflict suddenly burst out of relative peace? How do orderly societies find themselves thrust into violent disorder?
Well, it's actually pretty simple. You have to ask, which countries have the most capacity to do you harm? And when you ask that question, well, it'll be powers which have the most powerful military. And of course, Russia, along with the United States, are the world's two great nuclear powers. Besides that, Russia has probably the world's second most powerful conventional military. And you have a regime in the Kremlin which has a policy preference to tear up the peace that was established in Europe after the Cold War. And with this policy preference, they conducted a war in Georgia. They seized Crimea in Ukraine by military force, and they're conducting a war in Ukraine's east right now. it's pretty clear to me that the greatest national security danger we face today is a very revisionist Kremlin. By definition, that's a global problem requiring global leadership by the United States. And we haven't really seen that.
In 2013, the government of President Yanukovych made the decision to suspend the Ukraine-European Union Association Agreement and instead seek closer economic ties with Russia. Protests broke out in downtown Kiev, beginning a wave of demonstrations known as the Euromaidan. The civil unrest lasted for several months. Petro Sidorenko was part of the Euromaidan protests. In this very square, he was struck with 4 rubber bullets fired by the former government's special police, or Berkut. One bullet entered the orbit of his eye, lodging 2 millimeters from his brain. Doctors saved his life, but he is now blind in his left eye. Eventually, the protests were successful, and President Yanukovych fled to Russia. But the costs were great. Over 100 protesters were killed.
Take something like the Red Line in Syria. President Obama set a red line, no use of chemical weapons. Bashar Assad crossed that red line by killing 1,000 people with sarin gas in Damascus. There were no consequences. 6 months later, Vladimir Putin, observing what happened in Syria, took Crimea in the space of a couple of days. Even then, there were almost no consequences. A few months after that, he began a process of essentially trying to annex eastern Ukraine, because he understood that he could also flagrantly violate international law and not suffer serious consequences for that violation.
In 1982, a theory was introduced by American social scientists. The theory was based on an experiment. Researchers left a car with a broken window on a street in New York City. At first, people merely strolled by, looking at the damage. Time passed and the car remained untouched, until some unspoken notion took hold of the neighborhood, that no one cared about the car or the broken window. So who would care if someone broke another one? So someone did. Before long, all the windows were broken. The radiator and the stereo was gone, the upholstery was shredded, and children played on the wreck that remained. The broken windows theory suggests that disorder met with apathy leads to crime. If a window is broken and remains unfixed, it sends a signal that no one cares. And then pretty soon all the windows will be broken.
Applied internationally, it's a similar principle. It's the idea that the example of one country causing one source of disorder can in fact create an environment, a permissive environment for other countries to behave the same way. So I think that there is a kind of an international theory of broken windows that quite aptly describes the world in which we live today.
This Ukrainian army outpost is about 10 kilometers from the front lines, well within range of light artillery. One of the commanders is a former university professor, inspired to join the fight.
I simply decided that I cannot more stay in house, because day by day you are receiving information about events, and you are like you are becoming a little bit nervous. And I am a patriotic person. This flag for me is very important symbol for entire my life. So we have to fight for our land, because we are not on the territory of Russia or another country. We are on our own land, and we need to fight for it. Practically every machine has its own name. This machine is titled Kotygoroshko. Kotygoroshko, it is name of hero from legend. This is small young man who is very strong, who can fight enemies very effectively.
The name is quite appropriate. Ukraine is the young small combatant, and certainly the underdog in the battle against neighboring Russia.
Life in the Donbass, February of 2014, was normal. And people had jobs, they had lives, they had food. Then Moscow began this hybrid war, in April of 14. And as a result of that hybrid war, I think the current number is 2.2 million people fled. And the people who've remained have it very difficult.
Alexander and Irina's home was heavily damaged by separatists. Twice it was struck with rocket-propelled grenades. Alexander was beaten close to death. He believes it was because of his pro-Ukrainian views. As a result of the attack, he suffered traumatic brain injury. His scars are clearly visible.
We should provide lethal aid to the democratically elected government of Ukraine so that they can defend themselves. And we should not try to pretend that Russia's aggression in Crimea never happened. We shouldn't normalize abnormal, lawless behavior.
The United States has no obligation to come to Ukraine's aid. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and so is not entitled to NATO defense. And the US would risk war with Russia by attempting to return occupied territory to Ukraine. So what is done instead? The United States Army is here in Yavoriv in western Ukraine, not to liberate occupied territory, but to teach. This is the Joint Multinational Training Group Ukraine, a training operation meant to transform Ukraine's armed forces into a modern professional military that will hopefully be able to keep more of its land from being seized.
Hey, they're going. They're going. Ближе, ближе, ближе. Пошел.
So what is this that we're seeing?
What you're seeing, sir, this is our squad level live fire. The big things we're looking for, as you can kind of tell, is if they bound when they're supposed to. The big thing we're trying to show them is that in order for before someone maneuvers, someone else has to be providing covering fire, and they kind of control and organize, synchronize all that. And this is just a culmination of the squad level. This is kind of how we certify them as a squad.
The training is thorough, but no lethal aid, like weapons and equipment, is provided by the United States.
Mr. Putin has said, and senior Russian officials besides Putin have said, that there need to be new rules of global order or there'll be no rules. They've said that the post-Cold War settlement in Europe is unacceptable to them. They have said that they have the right, in fact the duty, to protect not just ethnic Russians, but Russian speakers wherever they live. Those arguments were used to justify the Kremlin's aggression in Georgia. They were used to justify the Kremlin's aggression in Crimea. And 25% of the people in Latvia and 25% of the people in Estonia are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. So the Kremlin could use the same logic to conduct military operations in the Baltic states, who happen to be members of NATO, whom we are bound by NATO charter to defend with our military.
Meril Megre is National Security Advisor to Estonian President Toomas Hendrik Ilves.
Of course, it concerns us, the fact that Russia has violated international law in annexing Crimea, in attacking Ukraine, in throwing the international rule book out of the window. It concerns us that a powerful country in Europe sees that the use of force is the way to go. And for us, what is important is the transatlantic link to work, the US to be together with Europe. Because from a small country's point of view, it's pretty obvious for us that alone we cannot succeed much.
This is the Narva River, which separates Estonia from Russia. On one side is the Estonian city of Narva, on the opposite bank is the city of Ivangorod. The fortresses of these two cities have faced each other across the waters for centuries. The silent stone ramparts and towers bear witness to much conflict, conquest and reconquest, including pivotal battles in 1944, which led to the Soviet Union's occupation and control of Estonia, which lasted until Estonia's independence in 1991. This is Operation Saber Strike, an annual military exercise in the Baltic states, led by the US Army. This year, the exercise is here, in Estonia. Since 2010, the militaries of NATO members and partners commit time and resources to engage in a display of their military prowess, and hopefully to project a convincing deterrent power. So what does this multinational deterrence look like?
Saber 3, this is Tower 6. Result report follows.
For the countries very small like Estonia or Latvia and Lithuania, it is very important to develop its own defense forces, its own capabilities, but more importantly, it is very important to work with our strong allies in order to deter the enemies, whoever they might be.
This is what allies do. We train together, and so this is working our interoperability, and this is ensuring that we as an alliance work well together and making sure we're prepared. And there's no better way to keep the peace than to be prepared.
Estonia is a NATO member state, so is entitled to the protections of Article 5 in the North Atlantic Treaty, which states that an attack on any member state guarantees a defensive response from the others. But if the prospect of war does rear its head, to what lengths would NATO member states go to defend a NATO ally? Would the US really risk war with Russia to defend Estonia?
I would think that there'd be tremendous confidence. I mean, the words of our leaders going back to President Truman have been that the United States is the guarantor, along with our allies, of peace. The U.S. has always had this tension between the forces that want to collaborate in the world and be involved and those that say, you know, the more isolationist tendency to mind our own business and stay home. But every time that we've followed that inclination, situations deteriorate. You know, it's a lesson we learn over and over again, but I have no doubt, and I don't think my colleagues in the U.S. government have any doubt that the secret to success is U.S. involvement.
Look, during the Cold War, we risked nuclear war with the Soviet Union to defend this little outpost of freedom called West Berlin. From an objective military point of view, it was an indefensible position. And yet we garrisoned West Berlin, we stood up that city, and in time it became a giant advertisement for the superiority of capitalism over communism. It's not an accident, comrades, that when the Cold War ended, it ended in Berlin. It ended with that wall. So our willingness to commit to the defense of that little city ended up paying the biggest dividend of all.
There are few places in the world where the lines between nations and ideologies are so clearly defined as the Narva River, which quietly demarcates Estonia's sovereignty. On the best of days, it seems to create a wide divide between the two nations. But in times of uncertainty and aggression, it appears to be little more than a stream.
There is a sense in which American foreign policy is at its best when we really face a crisis. But at the same time, when things, when things don't seem to be that urgent, we want to get back to watching, TV. We're not Sparta. America is not a society that's organized for war, conquest, and foreign policy. The core of our society is Americans enjoying the freedom to express themselves and do what's in them to do. And usually then what happens is somebody comes along and whacks us on the head with a 2x4 and reminds us that there's a world out there and we need to think about it.
This is the Tempelhof airfield, the famed staging ground of the Berlin airlift of 1948. This is where America and its allies flew over a Soviet blockade to bring desperately needed supplies into West Berlin.
For 15 months, hundreds of planes landed here carrying thousands of tons of cargo per day, everything from milk to coal. So the West Berliners wouldn't be starved into submitting to Soviet control.
The Berlin airlift served an immediate humanitarian need, but it was something more. It was a clear expression of America's vision for the economic and ideological future of a post-World War II Europe. Today, Germany is a unified and democratic state and a major economic power. How does America's commitment to fostering free liberal democracies still apply today? Are the cries of the oppressed still enough to rouse American action?
During 2015, Germany admitted over 1 million refugees, many of whom were fleeing the war in Syria. They arrived by the busloads each day. Men, women, entire families are ushered into these reception areas to begin the long process of registration and eventually integration into German society. Haman and his wife and 2 small children fled their home when the violence became too much to bear. Shortly before leaving Syria, Haman was struck in the back by a stray bullet.
The Middle East is considered by some to be the graveyard of empires. Does it make sense for the US to remain involved there?
You know, it would be lovely if the Middle East played by Las Vegas rules. What happens in the Middle East stays in the Middle East. But it doesn't. And we're seeing that every other day of the week, from San Bernardino to Brussels to Paris to Orlando. That's why the United States has to be involved. Now, how it's involved, to what degree, that's a separate question. But the idea that we can simply pivot away from the Middle East, that we can let the Middle East stew, as it were, in its own juices and imagine that it will not affect us, has been disproved by the events of the last few years, disproved very decisively. From the refugee crisis to the ISIS crisis to the crisis of credibility, all of that comes out of the Middle East and of our diffidence in involving ourselves decisively, prudently, and intelligently.
Syria is dead. There is no Syria. I think at a very early stage in Syria, the United States could have co-opted the moderate opposition, armed them, given them uniforms and arms, and supported a moderate opposition, which was mainly a secular opposition. So had the United States supported these people, they were then in favor of democracy.
We had, under President Bush, an overcommitment to trying to fix broken societies. It cost a great deal of money. It doesn't work. We then had, under President Obama, a desperate desire to get out and let the chips fall where they may. And we've discovered that doesn't work so well either. Even if we can't fix what ails these societies, we can shore up our friends, our democratic friends like Israel, as well as non-democratic friends like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. We can deter aggressors, and we can destroy those jihadi groups that are fundamental threats to any kind of order in the region.
We are observers. We only report, and we don't do anything. We don't stop people. That's not our job. The reason why the UN is doing this, because we are impartial. We're not taking part in anything of the conflict. So I think that is why the UN is so unique.
This is Mount Bentel in the Golan Heights, a disputed area at the northern end of Israel. From here one can look down upon Israel's border with Syria. And just over the border is the Syrian city of Quneitra. It's largely abandoned now, but gunfire can still be heard from occasional skirmishes there. And around 35 miles beyond that is Syria's capital, Damascus. For Israel, a country of only 71 miles across at its widest, conflicts in Syria and in the rest of the Middle East are not some far-off abstraction. On the contrary, they're a very real concern.
One of the consequences of the broken red line in Syria is that the United States lost considerable credibility in the eyes of Israel. So an Israel that previously could look to the United States for security guarantees, for regional guarantees, no longer seem anywhere near as solid. And I think the Israeli response has been hunker down, don't trust the Americans, rely on your own strength and your own wits to make your way in an increasingly unstable region.
The Golani Brigade stationed in northern Israel is in a constant state of training. The faces of these new recruits suggests total mobilization, the commitment of assets, both monetary and human, to maintain a defensive posture. Nearly everyone is drafted into the military here. But is that enough?
When it comes to the highest form of commitment, that is to go to war on behalf of somebody else or with somebody else, that's a very demanding point. And Israel has avoided throughout its history from asking that of the Americans. We are ranked within the 10 leading most powerful armies in the world, but this comes at a very stiff price. The Israeli people spends on the defense budget per capita place us in the second or third place in the world, to which you have to add the fact that men and women here devote the best years of their lives doing military stuff, which is quite a burden. But this is what gives Israel the capacity it has, which clearly in our culture relates to the human factor.
For Israel, there's no substitute for America as the ultimate ally. No other country in the world is going to give us something in the order of $4 billion a year in military aid. No one else is going to have the joint military movers, the intelligence sharing. It's one of the deepest strategic alliances which the United States has had with any foreign country in its post-World War II period. There's not going to be a substitute for Israel. This country is probably one of the few countries in the world where if the United States military had to land 40,000 troops on somebody's shore, they'd be greeted with flowers here and not rocks or worse.
Considered an unsinkable aircraft carrier, Israel is a sort of bastion of Western values in the Middle East and a barometer for tensions in the region. In turn, the US has served as guarantor of Israel's independence through military and diplomatic support. Has America's role in the Middle East changed? Is it still the ally it once was?
The United States is no longer going to be the policeman of the world. America is going to adopt a collegial approach to foreign policy, work together with allies, and not with traditional allies, but with new allies. A heavy reliance on international institutions such as the UN. A reluctance to project force.
America may be retreating from the Middle East, and if that happens, we are the losers, because America has been so much the mainstay of our security and has been and is still our ally in so many ways. Civilian, economic, political, emotional, cultural, you name it. Now, if that were to happen, should we look for substitutes? Should we look for some other powers that could give us and with us replace what America may be taking away? You have great powers emerging to the east. The Chinese, who give us no problem about the Palestinians. The Indians, who also couldn't care less about other things. These are the great powers. Others said, hold it, it's not only the east. We have a special relationship with Russia. So we should not withdraw from that special relationship.
The scary thing is that when America withdraws, some of these allies become freelancers. We sometimes criticize a country like Saudi Arabia as a freeloader, someone taking advantage of American security guarantees. But I would make the argument that on balance, a freeloader is better than a freelancer. If Saudi Arabia acquires nuclear weapons, which it could well do, if Saudi Arabia starts wars on its periphery, which it already has done, the consequences of those actions may ultimately be more serious to regional and international security than the price we have to pay for providing Saudi Arabia with credible security assurances. So we are better off globally when we are bonding often hostile countries like the Saudis, the Egyptians, the Israelis, the Taiwanese, the Vietnamese, to us in Washington, rather than allowing them to spin off unpredictably in different directions.
It is evening at the Western Wall in the Jewish quarter of the old city of Jerusalem. The whispered prayers of the reverend are joined by a louder devotion echoing off the limestone blocks. Another class of Israeli Defense Force cadets are graduating. The ranks of soldiers, like Israel's lease on the land, must constantly be renewed.
For well over 100 years, Great Britain had been the power that more or less maintained freedom of navigation around the world. The Bank of England ran what was the global monetary system of that time. People used to call that British system the Pax Britannica. The one thing that was clear after World War II was that the UK would no longer be able to do this. We need the kind of global common goods that the Pax Britannica used to provide. American exporters need to be able to trade all over the world. American manufacturers need to be able to buy goods. So how do we replace the Pax Britannica, and what do we replace it with? And out of that process came a mix of institutions and policies and commitments, and we've sort of grown used to calling that mix the Pax Americana, and it really is Pax Britannica 2.0.
The port of Manila. It is the largest port in the Philippines and one of the busiest in the world. About 75 million tons of cargo pass through here each year. This is just a glimpse of the total shipping industry in the South China Sea. Each year, $5.3 trillion in trade passes through these highly contested waters. And U.S. trade counts for $1.2 trillion of that total. This is one of many small commercial fish markets around Puerto Princesa in the Philippines. For the Philippines, as with many other nations in this part of the world, the fish pulled daily from the water are not just food, they're a major livelihood. The men who fish these waters must be patient. It takes long days and longer nights to reach the areas where the fishing is good. The captain of this ship is only 26 years old. He transports the independent fishermen and their small skiffs where they want to go. In exchange, he gets a percentage of their catch. Today they will fish the waters around Subi Reef. It is a rich fishing ground. It is also the site of a major Chinese military base. As their boat approaches Subi Reef, the captain and the crew grow nervous. They have been on the lookout for warning flares or skiffs, signs that the Chinese wanted them to leave. At one point, one of the fishermen comes up from below decks. He is afraid. Within 2 nautical miles of Subi Reef, the captain loses his nerve and turns back. The fish near the reef belong to the Chinese today. Antonio Carpio is a Supreme Court justice, an advocate for rule of law in the South China Sea.
In the 30s, Chinese cartographers drew several maps claiming the Paracels, the Pratas. Some claimed the entire South China Sea. We can pass a law in the Philippines saying that California is part of Philippine territory. As long as we don't do anything about it, the Americans wouldn't even mind. I mean, if China draws a map saying that the world is part of China, nobody would care. provided they just keep it to themselves. So when China drew up the map claiming the entire South China Sea, we just smiled because it's outrageous. However, China started to enforce it. They seized our submerged areas. Mischief Reef is a submerged area at high tide. They seized it from us in 1995. Every time we send our survey ships to the Reed Bank, Chinese Coast Guard vessels would harass them and shove them away. And in 1988, they seized Subi Reef from the Philippines.
Pag-asa Island is but a speck in the middle of the sea. As fishermen work in these shallow waters, an old wreck rusts atop the reef. This idyllic island is one of the few islands in the Spratly chain with fresh water. As a result, Pag-asa supports about 90 permanent civilian residents, although there are more dogs than people. The island is also occupied by a small Navy garrison. The Filipino sailors and Marines try to keep fit and occupied. A major activity is drying the fish they catch on the reef. They have no boats, and the defensive capabilities are dated and meager.
The Chinese government has actually told the Philippine government to leave or evacuate Pag-asa Island because according to them, all of the islands in the Spratlys are theirs. Some of our populace have fear that we might be invaded.
I think China's recent behavior is not necessarily a surprise. What you're saying is almost the implementation stage of a Chinese dream. That is, China must be respected by all the small countries in the region.
Pag-asa is tiny. One can easily walk across the island in 10 minutes. How long would it take to occupy it? In the setting sun, the Chinese base at Subi Reef becomes clearly visible. The scale of the construction is impressive. This reef was barren and mostly submerged just a few years ago. Now, an airstrip, hangars, control towers, a massive lighthouse, and cement processing facilities rise up out of these waters long held by the Philippines. From here on Pag-asa, the Filipinos watch and wait. One of the officers describes the standoff as a knife at their throat.
They believe that the United States, because of the financial crisis, the U.S. has been deeply wounded. Americans' economic power have been in decline. And that's why they say this is the time for them to take action, to challenge Americans' leadership.
Well, the United States for many decades has been a key guarantor of peace and stability in the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. has been guaranteeing freedom of navigation for all countries, trying to create an environment in which countries that have territorial disputes see that it's in their interest to settle them peacefully through negotiations rather than through the use of force.
If you look at China's territorial disputes with these maritime neighbors, most of them came as a result of China's illegal fishing.
80% of their coastal waters are polluted, so they have to fish further out. They have to go to the exclusive economic zones of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. And China has the highest per capita consumption of fish in the world. They have to feed 1.4 billion people. So their demand for fish is very, very high.
As the boat makes its way back to the Philippine mainland, a strange-looking ship approaches. It's a Chinese squid boat, and it is well within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone.
This Chinese fishing fleet essentially is China's militia. China's government has the power, authority, to order its fishing fleet to off-limits a certain area. It's one of the few countries in the world who can do that. And I think they're trying to provoke a conflict whereby China's civilian fishing boat will be viewed as a victim of an armed patrol vessels of another country. Therefore, China would now justify its own armed vessels coming in to protect its unarmed fishing vessels. So they're trying to gain moral ground.
freedom of navigation operations are something that we have done for decades. You know, I've participated in many of them. Most of them are hugely boring. We will go through areas where a country has made a claim that we believe exceeds that allowed by international law. And so we will sail or fly through that area. And oftentimes, indeed, maybe even most times, no one is even out there. But in the case of operations in the South China Sea that have been conducted recently, there have been some Chinese ships that have come out and will express their objection over a radio. May follow you as long as you're in what they perceive to be their space, and then break off and go away.
The US Navy is vastly larger and more powerful than the rest of the world's navies. Why must America shoulder the burden of paying for all of this?
No one else can do it. Look, I would love a world in which other countries all pitched in. We don't live in that world, and we can't simply say, well, because we wish we did, we're simply going to abandon our responsibilities. In the meantime, we require a world in which a strong U.S. naval presence guarantees our prosperity at home and guarantees the security of our allies abroad.
The fishing boat passes a Chinese Coast Guard ship at rest in Filipino waters. It will be relieved every 15 days. It is here to monitor the Philippines' most far-flung military outpost, the Sierra Madre. Intentionally grounded on a small reef called Second Thomas Shoal, this derelict World War II vessel is permanently manned by a ragtag group of Filipino Marines. They had just run out of water and gratefully accepted resupply from the fishing boat. They also enjoyed some luxuries they've long been without. The ship has no air conditioning. The heat is overwhelming. The generator has been broken for months, and the Marines must rely on limited power from inadequate solar arrays. Resupply by naval vessels is difficult, often blockaded by the Chinese Coast Guard, which waits and watches. The weapons on the aft and stern of the Sierra Madre no longer function, although the Marines move them from time to time so the Chinese don't get too comfortable.
The Chinese know that that ship is still in the roster of active Philippine Navy ships. So it's a public vessel of the Philippines, and under the Mutual Defense Treaty with the US, any attack on a public vessel of the Philippines can trigger the operation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So they're just waiting for the superstructure of the vessel to collapse. But the problem is the US has repeatedly said that it does not take sides in territorial disputes in the islands and rocks of Spratlys and the other areas in the South China Sea. When the US said we will not take sides, that was practically saying to China, go ahead, grab those reefs. And that's exactly what happened.
Second Thomas Shoal, if the Philippines is forced to remove their Marines because they can't live there anymore, China will take it over. And then that will be yet another victory. I think that every time that a country has a dispute with a neighbor and it wins using coercion or military pressure, it learns bad lessons. And I worry about some of the lessons that China is learning.
Why not let China be left to control its sphere of influence, just like the US has its sphere of influence?
Because China isn't the Netherlands or New Zealand. China is not a benign power that will simply perform the same benign functions that the American Navy does. China is an aggressive power with regional designs to conquer, seize, or control territories or maritime areas that other states rightfully claim as their own. You know, a world of spheres of influence is a world that ultimately leads inevitably to major power conflicts. So I'm not sure It's in anyone's interest to create this sort of brave new world in which China dominates the South China Sea and then can exercise economic hegemony over the United States by simply blocking the flow of traffic in waters that are vital to our economic self-interest.
The United States is a young nation with a place in the world beyond its years. To be so heavily relied upon by so many around the world wears on the American people. As one diplomatic tie is bound, another frays, and all the while the costs in blood and treasure are high. For how long can the United States keep up appearances? How long can the US remain the world's sole superpower?
All my life, what I've been hearing is America is in decline. You know, when I was in elementary school, first studying arithmetic, Sputnik, the Russians had launched the first satellite. Obviously, America's in decline. We're falling technologically behind the Russians. We're losing the Cold War. Then, you know, President Kennedy ran on the missile gap. Again, America's in decline. The Russians are winning. In the 1960s, Vietnam, America's lost its innocence. America's losing its first war. It's over. Woe is us. The oil embargo, it's over. We've lost. It's just the Arabs will rule the future. People used to talk about Japan the way many people have been talking about China, the inexorable great superpower. Japan is eating America's lunch. We've lost and they've won. It's all over. So I keep hearing that America is in decline, and yet it's a little bit like that Fort McHenry moment. The flag is still there, you know, all the bombardments all night, but dawn's early light, the flag is still there. I can personally remember about 60 years of anguish over American decline, never actually followed by American decline.
The United States has been the world's policeman for just over 70 years. It's not a long time by historical standards. We will be the dominant power for the rest of this century, and we need a foreign policy that is adequate to our primacy. We are not going to be going into an old age home and pensioned off into a comfortable retirement. We're still going to be the principal target for the Vladimir Putins and Ali Khamenei's and Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's of the world. And so long as we remain that number one nation, we need a foreign policy that reflects our place in the world, our interests, our values.
It is tempting to view America as a pompous, obtrusive hegemony. Such great power wielded primarily out of self-interest. Does America hold this role by some right? No, it does not. America's place in the world is maintained by its own actions, but it is ensured by many other nations and people of the world who rely upon the support of the United States. They recognize, through open gratitude or bitter resignation, that if this Pax Americana is not the ultimate world order, then surely there are no better alternatives. At least, not yet.
Major funding for this program was provided by Robert and Marion Oster. Additional funding was provided by Hoover Institution, Stanford University, L.E. Phillips Family Foundation, Sarah Scaife Foundation, the Lined and Harry Bradley Foundation, Incorporated, and FedEx.
Is America in Retreat is available on DVD. For more information or to order a DVD of this program, call 1-800-876-8930 or visit www.freetochoose.net.